Thank you all for joining the Australia 4.0 debate series, operating under the sponsorship of the Pearcey Foundation. The Pearcey Foundation acknowledges the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and all the traditional custodians who belong to the lands where the Pearcey Foundation and you, our guests, meet, live and work. We acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today and their elders past and present, whose stories, traditions and living cultures in this country are a valuable resource, as are those of all who have come to make Australia their home. Together, we are Australia. Welcome to the second event in the Australia 4.0 debate series. My name is Ian Opperman. I'm the chair of the Australia 4 activity. And this series of debates we have now commenced is the culmination of more than 4 years of effort, exploring the issues of the transition to net zero of the energy sector through the lens of data, digital and ICT. Australia needs a consistent approach to get to net zero, as the current debate is fractured, especially in the use of digital technologies in our infrastructure. Working with partners such as Standards Australia, Engineers Australia, the Australian Computer Society, the CSIRO, universities, regulators and consumer representatives, Australia 4 has tried to create a constructive space for this important dialogue. The goal of Australia 4 has been to identify a set of commonly agreed challenges and proposed ways to address them from a digital and data perspective. The summary of the first phase of Australia 4, which was 2023 to 2024, was released in a communique in May 2024. Since then, Australia 4 has continued with workshops held in conjunction with partners who care deeply about the transition to net zero, where we have addressed issues of putting consumer at the heart of the future grid, digitisation of the future grid, digital skills needed for future workforce and the standards required, as well as many other important elements of just how we get there. And during each of the workshops that we have run so far, we've sought to focus discussions through the lenses of ICT, innovation and benefit to Australia. Today, we approach the second of this series of 5 debates, addressing key issues identified during those recent workshops. These debates run every Friday for the next 3 weeks, so today and the next 3 weeks. And please do note that there is a Slido QR code available for you to participate online. Today's debate is entitled Creating the Consumer's Grid and will be moderated by James Seymour, who is the former CEO of C4Net. The way this will work today is that I'll soon hand over to James, and James will then give a quick outline of the basic proposition. There'll be an opportunity to answer a Slido question, introduce the speakers and then go into the substance of it, and then we'll come back and redo that Slido question around that consumer grid question. And the idea is that we get to dig into the nuance of this debate, thinking about it from data, digital, ICT and those other elements around benefit for Australia, and hopefully give you a better sense of the subtlety and nuance of the issue, but also really the thrust of the question. So, as mentioned, today's debate, second in the series of 5 weekly debates, and it's entitled Creating the Consumer's Grid, and we moderated by James Seymour. So James, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ian, and welcome to everybody. Great to have you join us today for this discussion. These series of debates are helping the nation move towards aimed at helping us move towards an efficient, effective, sustainable and profitable energy system based on DER and CER. And one of the challenges with that is then around how should we pay for that, and how should we invest in the infrastructure that's needed to support and deliver that. We're going to focus in today on how the network charges, which is one part of how we pay for our energy, how will those network charges, how they could evolve to support a consumer-oriented, CER-driven grid. So certainly I will go through just a couple of concepts, make sure we're all on the same page straight up. CER certainly is consumer energy devices. Today, we are going to scope this a bit into the household. We're going to look at it from a lens through a household consumer or a residential consumer. That's not to say that the business consumers or the industrial consumers are less important or anything. It's just that many of the issues that relate to households and to the connection of consumer devices connected at that household or behind the meter there are very, very similar type challenges that sit there for business, small businesses in particular. Once we get to the industrial and commercial, they tend to have defined and rather bespoke needs, and they're addressed in a different manner. Now, as we move into a heavy electrification a pathway over the next 3 years, and doing that with renewables, we know that we have a lot more energy to put through our system. So we need to generate that energy. We need to bring it to consumers or connect consumers. Of course, that generation won't just happen centrally. It will happen in a very distributed manner. It will be stored in a distributed manner and moved around the grid. And this gives us a whole lot of degrees of freedom that we haven't had before in the energy system and how to solve it. But where those assets go that interconnect us and have the storage and have the generation depends very much on how we invest in that. At C4Net, we involved 5 universities looking very deeply into how distribution systems will change as we go through electrification. And we're talking 2, 3 or more times energy that needs to be passed through the system. How that relates to then the infrastructure that's needed is largely driven by the power. So how we, at any point in time. But that infrastructure is a key component of our electricity bill that we pay. So when we pay our electricity bills, that includes both the wholesale or the supply side of the energy that we're paying, the network components, which is the infrastructure to interconnect between where it is generated and stored and where it is used and consumed, and also the retail component, which is very much then around settling in the market and the buy and sell and the consumer relationship that sits there and services that sit there with that. Most consumers or mass market consumers pay a single tariff for their rate or a time of use tariff for their rate that embodies all of those elements there. The retailer combines all of those elements and charges it through to our customers. And therefore, the network components are relatively opaque to many customers. The network component itself has 3 basic elements that are there. A fixed charge or a time-based charge, so what we pay a fee per day or per month for elements that are in there. There is a consumption charge, which is it varies by how much we use our electricity. And then there is a demand charge as well, which talks about the peak amount that we have, which demand is sometimes used in household concept, but relatively rarely. And you've seen the controversy that it's called recently because of the confusion that it can create for customers. Importantly, network charges are a recovery of the cost of providing that service. These are regulated asset businesses whereby the total cost gets socialized across all consumers through a regulated process that's regulated by the AER and set by the AEMC. How that is actually charged and divided up, that cost recovery to consumers, is in part by their network tariffs, but those network tariffs are then passed on to the retailers. Ultimately, it is the retailers who decide how reflective or how that is passed back through to the customer. The question is, as we move into having a whole lot more CER connected, how ubiquitous we are as consumers changes quite a lot. Where now, some people will have large generation and storage themselves and may not be using that much of the grid, or may not be using the grid as often, but they are using it as a reliability element and having a connection there and being able to both import and export their energy. Some consumers can't access CER for whatever reason, and therefore they are just straight consumers of energy from the grid. And of course, as we electrify, the amount of electricity that we use will change dramatically. So as we either engage electric vehicles or electrify gas, for those who have been using gas up to now, there'll be some customers who will be rapidly accelerating their electricity use, while others will be smaller. So that creates quite a bit of complexity for how we actually charge for electricity and how we balance this in a fair and equitable way that still provides the incentive mechanisms that we want in order to have people, where it is economically sensible, investing in CER equipment, solar, batteries, and so on, or connecting those equipment for demand response through their EVs or through VPPs and so on. So there's quite a complex element. Today, what we're going to try and explore is the concept that to optimise the personal, community and system benefits of a high CER system, the statement we're saying is that it's inevitable that the fixed component of network charges will need much greater weighting. That is a fairly contentious topic in itself, or a contentious statement in itself. And today we have 4 excellent debaters who are well informed on this topic that we're going to explore. Just before I introduce the debaters though, what I would like you to do is to consider that topic that I just mentioned. And we're going to pull out our phones and connect to the Slido mechanism. So Karen, if we can just bring up the Slido slide. Please do come in, connect to the Slido. This is important because we want you to very much post your questions for the debaters to address after they've finished speaking about or providing their presentation. Please use your name. It does help. To cast your vote, get out your mobile phone now and just connect through the QR code there. And very much, we'd like you to cast your vote now, even before you hear from our esteemed debaters, as to the very central question that we've got. So we'd love to see some connections coming through there now. So I'm going to ask you to, that's great. We will revisit this question at the end of the debate. And I'm sure, which will pamper beautifully to the egos of our debaters to see, have they been able to successfully influence you today by making their arguments. Okay, please do continue to pop that comment in. I'll come back and revisit this in just a moment. I'm going to introduce you to our speakers now for today. For the affirmative team, we have 2 speakers. Ashley Bradshaw. Ashley is the Executive Manager for Advocacy and Analysis at Energy Consumers Australia, or ECA. ECA is the peak national body representing households and small business energy consumers. And Ashley's had an experience as a market analyst with RENI, with ACCC, with AER, and a lot of experience in looking at the market side of our energy system. Ashley will be joined by the second speaker for the affirmative, Tim Ryan, who's Director of Ready Energy. Now, Tim's recently been appointed as the consumer voice, which is a statutory position on the committee of the Data Standards Advisory Committee, which is used by the Data Standards body. The Data Standards body is responsible for MyID and the consumer data rights, so a really key position and advisory position through to government. For anyone who's been on LinkedIn, they will understand that Tim's always up for a debate and always up for sharing his views on the energy system, particularly from a consumer perspective. Debating them today will be on the negative. And it looks like, as we see the active poll at the moment, it looks like they're going to have their work cut out for them in trying to convince you of their position. Our first speaker for the negatives will be Heidi Lee Douglas. Heidi's CEO of Solar Citizens, which is an independent not-for-profit group that has mobilised over 200,000 supporters across Australia advocating for cleaner, cheaper and people-powered energy. Heidi wears a number of hats. She's also Deputy Mayor of Bayside Council in New South Wales, which is one of the first, is where one of the first urban renewable energy zones is being developed. Solar Citizens recently put in some submissions into the NEM review that are particularly relevant for this very issue and debated and argued against higher fixed charges. Solar Citizens played a key role in advocating for the home battery program that we are enjoying seeing rolled out right now. Heidi will be followed by Craig Memory, Senior Advisor at the Justice and Equity Centre, and who also sits on some committees with the Consumer Committee for the ISP, or Integrated System Plan, which is AEMO's central plan for the rollout of energy system across Australia and the evolution of the energy system across Australia. Craig assures us that he is the least competitive person around, and that he is willing to listen to anybody and consider anything, except when it comes to debates, when that will bring out his inner strength as inner competitiveness. And so hopefully he'll be able to bring it home for the negative team there with Heidi. We're about to go into our first speaker, who will be Tim. Just before we do, could we just check that Slido poll, just where it's at the moment? There we go. So 1/3, 2/3. Heidi and Craig, you've got your work cut out for you. Tim, sorry, Ashley. Ashley, would you like to lead us off for the first speaker for the affirmative team?
Yeah, will do. Thank you for the introduction, James, and thank you to the Pearcey Foundation for having us. I'm sure as many people will be well aware, electricity prices remain a bit of a pressing and controversial issue in Australia, and no one likes paying energy bills, so there'll be an inevitable debate about who should pay them, even amongst consumer advocates, as you'll soon see. But it is an important debate, and I'm glad we're having it, so thank you. So we're talking about essentially how to pay network costs, right? So fundamentally, the network connects suppliers of energy with buyers. So what value does it provide you as a homeowner or someone that lives in a home? So it provides you the ability to purchase energy, so to turn the lights on when you want to. If you have solar or a battery, it provides the opportunity to actually sell energy and make money. Beyond that, the network provides other services that are great for everyone, like public lighting. It supports emergency services. And there are probably some intrinsic values to having a network connection to your home. So for example, like there's a value to having a road or a water or sewage connection, right? So let's be clear, the network does not sell you electricity. You buy electricity from your retailer. Rather, the network sells you the opportunity to get it, and then also sell it yourself. Yet for several historical reasons, and many of which were valid at the time, the network recovers its costs through consumption prices. So when you pay electricity, when you actually think you're purchasing electricity, you're kind of actually paying off the network. And many people don't know that. I think many people think when they see that daily fixed charge, what is it, around $1 to $2 a day, you think you're paying off the cost of their connection, but you're actually not. So recovering network costs through consumption prices just doesn't really make much sense kind of when you think about it. And then looking forward though, and importantly, network consumption pricing is just not going to be fit for purpose, sustainable or fair. And I'll go through a couple of points to explain why. So first, and this was James greatly articulated, is the energy system is changing. We have so much renewables coming into the grid, and a lot of that is coming from your neighbor, from households, right? And around 1 in 3 households have solar, and around 2 to 3% of households have a battery now, and this will no doubt grow. So this means for large periods of time, many households will not actually be buyers of electricity, and at other times they will actually even be sellers, and they'll be making money, and that's great for them. It's good for everybody. Well done. But with network consumption pricing, these people will inevitably pay less for the network, yet they will still get all the benefits from it. They'll get backup power when they need it. They'll still make money when they export power, etc. Is that fair? Second, the way we price the network is actually holding back the energy transition. So, for example, there are times when the wholesale price of electricity is remarkably negative, meaning we actually want people to use electricity, and so in other words, you can get paid for using electricity. But you don't see these benefits because network consumption charge is higher. Now, large-scale generators don't pay these charges, but you, with your battery and solar system, do. It's just not a level playing field. It's also a missed opportunity, primarily to show those without solar and batteries, the amazing benefits of renewable energy, that there are periods where it's abundant and it's cheap and it's clean, but network consumption prices don't show people that. Now, also, as more and more electricity comes from local sources, like your neighbor's rooftop, it just doesn't make sense to charge you as if that electricity traveled hundreds of kilometers through an entire transmission and distribution network, right? Just the pricing model itself is outdated. It just doesn't reflect how electricity will be generated and shared in a modern distributed system. So third point, my last point, is that the current model is becoming unsustainable. So network costs are, to a large extent, from your perspective, fixed. If you buy solar, the poles and wires just don't disappear, right? They still have to be there. And in fact, as people reduce their consumption, there's strange things can happen where the cost per unit of electricity can actually go up because there are fewer units to spread those costs over. So maybe explain this a bit. So imagine this. Imagine everyone on your street decides, all right, we're just going to only use electricity on a Sunday. We're not going to use it any other day. Now, the poles and wires will still be there. They'll still need to be maintained. They'll still need to be kept safe, etc. But now, all those costs will have to be recovered from just one day of use. This means that, sadly, consumption prices will inevitably go up. Not because the network has become more expensive, even the network could have become cheaper, but it's because we're just using the wrong pricing model. And here's the kicker, right? So if one neighbor happened to not be there on that day where you all gathered around and agreed to do this, and they kept using electricity on a Monday to Sunday, they will start paying more, even though they haven't changed their life at all. And that's just not fair or equitable. To come back to the real world example for a bit, this could mean that those without solar and batteries, so those who don't own their own home or live in an apartment, will not see the benefits of the transition that they've been promised, and society will become more inequitable. That's why we just simply need to move away from network consumption pricing. Now, that doesn't mean we don't need to think about how we set the fixed charges. It just means we need to start recovering network costs in a way that actually reflects the inherent value of the network and the true nature of their costs. So to sum it up, the network is an essential service. It's essential infrastructure, like your roads, like water. We all benefit from it. The way we're using it is changing, but the pricing models just aren't sustainable and we haven't kept up. And the current model is just unfair. Thank you.
Excellent, Ashley, and eloquently put, Heidi. Your opportunity to put your side of the argument, please.
Thanks, James. I want to acknowledge the Gadigal and Bidjigal of the Eora Nation. I come today from the shores of Kamay or Botany Bay in South Sydney. So this is a big question and one at the heart of a lot of what Solar Citizens does. And I'm arguing for the negative, but in this case, my argument is to be positive, to push for a rewiring of our relationship with energy and energy pricing that encourages participation. As the world looks towards COP31 and Australia potentially co-hosting with the Asia Pacific, that amazing conference, the big question is, how do we power prosperity without leaving anybody behind? So rooftop solar and distributed energy are the low-hanging fruit of the clean energy transition. They enable energy equity, carbon reduction, and cost of living solutions. But to realize that potential, we must move away from monopoly energy generation to distributed energy participation. We have to give the power back to the people to make power for the people. For a century, we've managed supply with giant generators turning to meet invisible demand. But now flexibility lives behind the meter, in electric vehicles, home batteries, and even in factories. Consumers have become energy producers, traders, and balancers. And our recent federal election delivered more than a change of government. It delivered a very strong message about energy. Voters overwhelmingly rejected centralised, top-down energy plans, including nuclear, and chose a future built on rooftops, batteries, and neighbourhood power. And that mandate matters. It tells us that Australians want their own energy that they can trust and participate in. That's not demand management, it's demand empowerment. Millions of citizens forming the adaptive layer of the grid. It's no longer a pipeline, it's an ecosystem. So if you flatten the price signal, you flatten participation. And this proposition before us suggests that in a high consumer energy world, high fixed network charges are inevitable, but I disagree, because fixed charges reduce the very flexibility we need. With open data and digital orchestration, dynamic operating envelopes, we can achieve fairness and efficiency without erasing consumer choice. Let consumers participate while keeping the system stable. I've read that my colleague who's speaking today, Craig, has warned that shifting most networks' cost to fixed charges might stabilise revenues, but destabilise trust. Higher fixed charges decouple people from agency. Your bill doesn't fall when you save energy or invest in solar, so why bother? Will it just encourage people to go off-grid if they can afford it? This would further punish the frugal and the vulnerable, renters, pensioners and carers, who would be lumped with greater costs, not unlike the death spiral of gas, as we must get off gas. So there are risks, but there are opportunities. Instead of supercharging fixed charges, let's supercharge dynamic incentives, lower tariffs for when the sun is shining, rewards for flexibility and battery storage, local credits for helping the grid. Profit should reward participation, not just extraction. Australian households have already invested in this, with more than $25 billion of their own money invested in rooftop solar, in every postcard and every political persuasion across the country. And now 1,000 batteries a day are being installed nationwide. That's one of the largest acts of voluntary climate action anywhere in the world. Yet this proposal is suggesting treating our citizens, the real builders of our clean energy future, as passive consumers. We need not kill off incentives for participation. We need fair, transparent ways for households to earn from the value they create. That means local energy trading, access to virtual power plants, and dynamic export pricing so that every roof, battery, and electric vehicle helps to stabilise the system and lower bills. Without those signals, we'll be leaving billions of dollars and goodwill idling behind the meter. And there's anxiety about artificial intelligence data centres being energy hogs, but if we treat them as partners, they can actually help balance the grid. Modern data centres can time shift computer loads, ramping up when renewables surge, ramping down when the grid is tight. If located within fair, democratically run urban renewable energy zones, they can soak up local rooftop solar, anchor larger batteries, and act as demand batteries for our cities. So at Solar Citizens, we're pushing to activate best practice urban renewable energy zones across Australia, turning industrial estates, shopping and community centres and warehouses into big roof, solar and storage hubs. These precincts could generate clean power closer to where it's used, feed flexible loads like EVs and data centres, reduce costly transmission upgrades, but they will depend on open access to local energy spatial mapping data. Because transparency builds trust, and when governments and networks share data on solar potential, grid constraints and hosting capacities, communities and councils and businesses can plan and collaborate intelligently. When people can see the map, they can see themselves in the solution. And this transformation doesn't just stop at our shores. Through the Raise the Roof Global Solar Pledge campaign that we are launching right now, we're working with partners across the Asia Pacific to help countries increase their rooftop solar and battery capacity by 2030. It's how we turn international commitments into community-powered action, showing that distributed energy can also form distributed leadership. We don't have an energy scarcity problem, we have an engagement problem. If we get this right, Australia can show the world from COP31 in Adelaide to every rooftop in the Asia Pacific region what a people-powered energy revolution looks like. A democratized energy system can empower people, improve lives, and rebuild trust, an antidote to political apathy and disillusionment. Profit should come Profit becomes a signal for innovation, saving becomes the reward for participation, and fairness becomes the foundation for resilience. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. Well put. Now, I don't know where everyone's sitting, but you're going to have to start trying to balance up these two sides. Tim's going to trying to come back nice and strong here. What I would ask you to do just before Tim speaks is to be thinking of questions that are jumping into your mind as the speakers go, and post those into the Q&A so that we can address them afterwards. Tim, Heidi set a high bar there. Just coming off mute, Tim.
Wasting my best line up against a politician. Well done, Heidi. There was lots in that, and I think there's areas where there's definitely collaboration, right? So, at a first point, there is no doubt we need more solar on more roofs. We need more abundancy. I don't think anyone's can argue with that. Our really big problem at the moment, though, is we are having massive curtailment, and that curtailment is largely because of the things that Ashley outlined in the opening statement, that we actually have friction in our network charges. The oppositional effect, the point that Ashley and Heidi made, I'd like to highlight the fact that we are not talking about a single silver bullet tariff structure that applies to everybody. There's certain parts of it we've got to approach, and we've got to try and make it work for everybody. But certain parts of it we're trying to get and engage people to deliver the outcomes we need. Now, the fundamental problem is this friction, the friction that exists between our network costs and the price of energy. At the moment, the historical model of the energy system was such that we had a vertical stack of generation to transmission to distribution, and we paid for it, and the money flowed back through the stack to the various parties. In the wisdom of trying to recycle money, our government sold off the generators and networks that they owned and the retail businesses they owned. They were supposed to be three separate chunks. In the UK, there still are three separate chunks. But in Australia, our investment bankers were better. They combined the generators and the retailers together to gentailers. And then through a bit of magic events of trying to make it all happen, we ended up with three singly big businesses, gentailers, that controlled our environment. They have sought successfully to make any changes to network tariffs that affect how their model works. So in effect, we've actually perpetuated the historical model of having a vertical stack. What we need to do is actually try and work out how to unpack that now we've got decoupling. And that decoupling has come from us having our own energy resources and also having flexibility. There's a Pearcey thing here. We're very focused on ICT, data, communications and services. We now have the ability to have more data, to understand services and understand how we can use it more. And we've gone from having a fixed tariff that covered everything, and to point to Heidi's question about, are we disadvantaging poorer people? The historical thing was with these tariffs, consumption tariffs were brought in so that the burden of the cost recovery was paid for by the people who used more. So what we've got now is the people that are using less are paying more. And that sort of sounds a little bit bizarre. But what we've got is if I've got self-consumption and I've got the ability to sell it and not pay for the network, I'm actually one of those people that actually had been cross-subsidising it. And I find when I talk to people and you actually explain the theory of it, most people go, well, that's not right. And in fact, I rebuilt my house 12 years ago, and I put in a generation system, a support system was such that I never paid a cent in cost recovery during the peak periods. I fell off my donkey on the road to Damascus and worked out that wasn't fair. Most people, other people I talk to, it isn't. But what I do know now is, with the variability we have in energy prices and the fact that it's not variable renewable energy, but forecastable renewable energy, we've got to use that abundance. We've got buffers. We've got buffers in our hot water systems. We've got buffers in our batteries. And we're going to have even bigger buffers in our EVs with vehicle to home and vehicle to grid. And what we've got to stop is the models that are being driven out there at the moment by AEMO and the gentailers that see to run VPPs that are ostensibly promoted as being giving us something back, while at the same time trying to charge us for energy that might have come from our battery as part of that management process as they build their hedge books. So we have a fundamental problem here that we need to try and address to deliver a more equitable and reasonable and fair future. Now, one of the big things about having a fixed fee is there's no friction. And the only time you impose friction is with a dynamic operating envelope when there actually is genuine congestion. Now, Heidi made a couple of references to dynamic operating envelopes, but exclusively at the moment in the perspective of there being a thing around export limits. Now, the historical thing was we had export limits on how much energy we could export because it wasn't metered, it wasn't controlled, it wasn't whatever. And it was free because there was no export fee on it. Solar Citizens, before Heidi's time, came up with the term the sun tax around the unlocking DER. And it's not. It's actually trying to inject some balance into it. My preferred model is actually not having a volumetric fee on exports, because I think that's, again, counterproductive, because we want people to use it. So when it comes to having a fixed charge, a capacity charge, I choose what capacity limit I want as my guarantee. I want to have 5 kilowatts all the time. The network is built around that. All my neighbours are my zone sub. We get to a point, I know the capacity limit is at a certain amount, and there is always going to be reserve capacity. In our network, except for 20 hours, one day, 20 hours, 20 weeks a year, we basically have a problem with capacity. Apart from that, the capacity is going begging. So I might subscribe for 5 kilowatts. So I plug my EV in with a 22 kilowatt charger, and the network signals back to my DOE, knock yourself out. Knock yourself right out and load it up as much as possible. And this then brings to the point of what used to be the alternate for demand tariffs, was peak demand tariffs, which would say, well, I'm actually using 30 kilowatt hours, so I should pay as though for this capacity all the time. That's not what it's about. It's actually about trying to make maximum productivity and energy cost efficiency by using cheap energy. So when the energy is cheap, network capacity, I load up. When it's not, I don't. If the network gets congested, I pull back to my subscription level and everybody's happy. Or alternatively, if it's still congested, I would get paid to fix congestion if I was exporting, if it's an import congestion, and someone else that is exporting would pay a higher fee to reflect that. So we've got to try and think about how we make the system more more flexible.
Tim, I'll get you just to wrap up your point here. So
no, I'm happy to leave it for Q&A type now. I think I've sort of covered both, trying to link Ashley and Heidi's together to try and find a common point. And now it's over to the super competitive Craig, who's warned us all on our little pre-warm-up session that there's only one competitive thing in his life, debating.
Over to you, Craig.
Thank you all. And I would say it's not strictly true. I did tell a bit of a fib. There's another area where I get competitive, and that's about Eurovision. I'm a real Eurovision fan, and I think it's both a source of great international peace and competition at the same time. I'm joining you from unceded Gadigal land today. I'd like to acknowledge our Aboriginal elders, past and present and emerging. Thanks to the Pearcey Foundation, to James for inviting us. Big thanks to Ashley and Tim for your great contributions, but most of all, thanks to Heidi. You're excellent. I can't compete with that. All I can hope to do is not lose some of the valuable ground that you've obviously gained for our team. And I'd like to acknowledge the intelligence that Ashley and Tim both bring to this. I was thinking before the debate, you know, they're very forward-thinking and visionary people who are dealing with big changes that we need for the future. And it reminded me a bit of Thomas Jefferson, quite a brilliant polymath and a founding father. And in many ways, Ashley and Tim are founding fathers of the energy transition. And then I was reminded, of course, that Jefferson did have a downside, and that was that he was a bit pro-slavery. He even kept slaves, apparently. And it led me to thinking, well, high fixed charges are also a bit like, they create slaves. High fixed charges actually create energy slaves. People who can't change their circumstances, no matter how much work they do, no matter what they deserve, no matter what opportunities they deserve, they can't break free from the shackles of higher energy charges. And I'm going to come back to some of the impacts that has on people. I am going to acknowledge that I think I agree with Tim and Ashley about what the problem is. We actually spend a lot of time out in the real world trying to fix this problem. Current tariffs don't work. They do need to change. They come with problems. They create inequities. The challenge here that we're really debating is what's the right solution. Some fixed charges do absolutely make sense. We've always had some fixed charges, and it makes sense to even increase them a little bit. The contested debate is, what do we do with the amount of energy that can be shifted, that could be variable, that could go one way or another? And this is where there are better solutions than fixed charges, which create 10 problems for each one that they solve. Firstly, I'll address a misapprehension. High fixed charges as an idea often are supported with the idea that nothing you can do to change your energy changes the cost of the distribution network and the transmission network system. This is a very backwards looking and short-sighted idea. Now, I'm not sure how you're backwards looking and short-sighted at the same time. Maybe you need eyes in the back of your head and to forgot your glasses, I don't know. But it does ignore two important things. One, we have growing demand from electrification, and that's a good thing. We have growing use of electricity networks. In that context, curtailing peak demand saves us all money, and it will continue to do so. High fixed charges have the opposite effect. They encourage people to use more energy at peak demand. They exacerbate that impact on the network. On top of electrification, Heidi mentioned data centers. Data centers are potentially driving up energy demand in the order of 10% or more in some areas at a locational level in some years. And so this is a big strain on the grid. There is an idea that people who are pro fixed tariffs have, that it's a good idea to use the peak demand capacity that's there, a bit like Everest theory, climate because it's there. Really, the fact that capacity is there should serve as a buffer, not as something that we make sure that we use and then inevitably overuse. Heidi touched on the sustainability elements of the argument, so I won't go into those in the detail, other than to point out that when the return on investment for people's CER and DER and solar and batteries and so on shrinks, with it shrink the climate benefits that is brought by that. This delays the transition to a cleaner grid and penalises households who are trying to do their bit to get us there. As a consumer advocate, having looked at this issue for years, and I want to move away from the humorous stuff and drill down to something really serious right now. We look at the distributional impacts on people. We look at how people use energy now. Now, if everyone used the same amount of energy at the same time and didn't respond to price, fixed charges would be perfect for recovering each and every cent of network expenditure. That's not the real world we live in. At the bottom decile, you've got about 1 million households in Australia who use around 5 kilowatt hours or less. At the top decile, you've got a similar amount whose average is fast approaching 50 kilowatt hours a day. And that is speeding, that particular group is increasing dramatically with electrification. The idea that a large fixed charge could be fair for both that person using 5 kilowatt hours a day and the person using 10 kilowatt hours more does not pass any pub test. It does not pass any radio callback test. Thanks for the wave, Tim. You can address that when it's your chance. And when we've done analysis on this, we've found out that, well, if you spread the cost impacts accordingly, as a fixed charge does, you get 1 million people in that low quintile, in that lowest decile, in apartments who don't have solar, whose bills could be going up in the order of $400 a year. Those are real numbers based on real analysis. So I want to pause and ask you, how would you explain that to the pensioner who's downsized to a modest 2-bedroom apartment to manage their cost of living, who use energy frugally so they can stretch their meager funds so that they can take an annual holiday? When they call up Talkback Radio, how do you explain to them why they need to find an extra $10 a year to fix a problem that is not of their making? Because they're not contributing to that peak demand. They're not contributing to the demand growth. Now, I don't want to suggest that our energy enslavers here actually are intentionally doing this to this pensioner. I would invite you to express sympathy for their ignorance. I think they don't know what they do. And I think if they used both sides of the envelope to do their calculation of the economic impacts rather than just the back, they might start to look at these distributional impacts on people and realize that the idealized idea of recovering all these costs doesn't necessarily play out in a fair society in the way it might be expected. It's landing in the context of a whole lot of interlinked systems, social, economic, and energy systems. And I'm very pleased to say that there are better and future-proof options. One such option is moving to a combination of a fixed charge and peak demand charges, which still allows people to change their behavior, particularly people with solar and batteries, while still paying their way if either they choose not to, or they change their behavior to use more energy as they might in electrification. In summary, I'll say fixed charging for electricity for networks, it's unfair. It undermines the transition to clean energy. It fails to send proper price signals for efficient use of the network. It's a trifecta of social, economic, and environmental problems. And, you know, I note that there's a plan to install smart meters across the whole national energy market by 2030. They'll be ubiquitous. Let's not use smart meters for dumb tariffs. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Okay, so
I'm going to go first.
hold yours.
I'm sure
Oh,
Ashley's going to jump into it. Unless you had a question you wanted to ask anyone first, James?
No, I was just going to say, look, we've obviously heard of fairness, we've heard of unsustainability, we've heard of pricing mechanisms, we've heard of levies that can be used. Ashley and Tim, please, how would you respond to Heidi and Craig?
So there seemed to be a fundamental thing there, and Craig might correct me if I'm wrong, but there's an assumption that this fixed charge would be the same charge applied to every customer. No, absolutely not. Right. So this is part of it where we actually get to the point of a consumer having a subscription, which is them subscribing to a capacity that they choose, which fits into the model as being their guarantee. That's the benchmark they come back to if there's a congestion point. And this is, you know, to fit into fairness, that ideally the total sum of subscription revenues should add up to around about a third to 50% of the capacity that's available. Right? It should add up to all the money should pay for it, but it's really what's happening being used most of the time. The other thing, and most people rail against inclining block rates, but I'd advocate for an inclining block rate so that each kilowatt of capacity you bought as a guarantee, be it for export or for import, you pay a premium for over the previous kilowatt. And that goes to address some of the concerns that Craig's raised with people that have smaller capacity needs that are able to proceed. The other thing is a capacity charge or the guarantee. We can actually say for people who are low and medium income, pensioners, whatever it is, we can actually address those charges through other means and with regard to subsidies or otherwise done at a government level, or even imposing a cost on heavier users that sees those lower costs reduced for those users. I think most people will find that equitable. The other important point, as I did touch on it, Heidi done it before, but Craig did it again. dynamic operating envelopes are actually really focused on managing that peak demand problem that Craig's identified. We can't unspend money. Like the money that's been spent on networks, we can't unspend it. But what we can do is improve the productivity of it. So if we can shift load in any direction. We've seen huge problems affecting people with things like hot water charges, where consumers who have smaller tanks, living in apartments, housing commission or whatever, have been transferred over from a fully diversified flat tariff onto a time of use tariff. And then all of a sudden their bills have gone through the roof because of this volumetric cost. Their usage hasn't changed, their capacity hasn't changed, but all of a sudden they're getting blasted by these costs. And that's a real problem. So I'd argue that a capacity subscription metric with a dynamic operating envelope that manages peak congestion, in fact, manages all congestion, not peak congestion, and has an environment that tries to drive, a magic pudding effect behind a congestion point, has a whole lot of benefits to the system. And really, I think there is a misunderstanding of what a fixed charge in a subscription network would be versus what it would be in an ordinary environment. And it's very much like our mobile networks. Pick it up and we use it. We've got portability. If I have a subscription, I can take my car and I can drive 3 suburbs over and plug it in and use that subscription capacity there if the dynamic operating envelope in that location says there's spare capacity. And what we want to do is use that capacity when it's there, because what we're trying to do, Craig, is actually productivity so we don't spend more. We're getting that increased electrification. We want to float all the boats by actually not building a network for the big peak where the peak demand is, but actually keeping the traffic below that peak and floating all the other boats.
Ashley, did you have a quick comment you were going to add?
Yeah, a couple of important things. I mean, firstly, it was ironic that Craig admitted that fixed charges should rise. That's the context, that's the actual premise of the debate. So we've won automatically. It's kind of fun. This energy, the equity and fairness is really important, and understanding this. Yeah, Craig raises some good concerns. So, for example, we just wrote a paper on energy poverty. So it's kind of funny that he thinks I don't think about this stuff very well. People that are under energy hardship and poverty use considerably more energy. They are the biggest consumers of electricity. Customers that tell their retailer they're in financial hardship and are put on payment plans and hardship plans, they use nearly double on average the amount of electricity as customers without it. Renters as a whole use of the same household income, use way more electricity than homeowners of the same household income. So income alone, yes, it's kind of simplified analysis. I guess I'd probably say wealth is more important. It's like a proxy for it, but it doesn't take into those effects. And a lot of the reasons why homeowners consume less electricity than renters, from I look at the data, is essentially access to solar. So 50% of owner-occupied households have solar compared to about 7 or 8% of renters. So it's kind of this thing that actually is good. And we talk about slavery. Craig made the analogy of slavery. Where I actually get quite more emotionally struck by things is hearing about people that are withholding energy that they need. Now, Craig, well, that's a good thing for the system. That's a good signal for people. But around 1 in 10 households in Australia are saying they're not using heating or cooling to save money and they're under financial stress. So I just don't think it's a great welfare enhancing thing to put a demand tariff or this crazy signal on people when, to a lot of extent, it's tenuous at best whether there is even a cost of doing so. So we just need to think about it a lot more carefully. Like Tim said, there's a real opportunity to set these fixed charges smartly. And that's a great debate. I'd love to have that, and we should all get in a room and have that discussion. But yeah, I just wanted to say that, Claire. There's other things I'd say, but I'll leave it at that.
Great point, Ashley. Thank you. Heidi and Craig.
Well, I think there's a few things I'd like to say. I think we were talking about the burden of cost recovery for those who use less, but as you pointed out, Ashley, that poorer people have less energy efficient homes. So we definitely don't want to be burdening people who already can't afford the fancy appliances, it's from speaking from experience, I once picked up an oil heater on the side of the road when I lived in Northwood down the road from you, Tim. And I used it for one winter and then thought that I'd saved some money by not buying a heater, and I got $1,000 electricity bill because I didn't at that moment in my life realize that not all things are as efficient as each other. So I think, if you're getting people who don't have the disposable income, they can't always invest in the most efficient devices, so they don't have less energy bills, they have higher energy bills. So we do need to be careful that we're not then burdening them with a bigger fixed charge on that bill as well, just because they might be the ones who are using the most energy. So that is a real concern. I think the antidote to that is that we have all this abundant rooftop solar during the day, and it does make energy prices cheaper during the day. Everyone is benefiting from the $25 billion that Australians have invested domestically in their own rooftop solar. We are now seeing that movement for batteries to have those same cheap, clean energy day and night, and that will ultimately bring energy prices down for everybody. If we start to send the signals to people that it doesn't matter what they invest in, the return on investment will shrink. People will not outlay that money. It's already a little bit marginal for people with rooftop solar sometimes, whether or not they should invest in batteries, but now with the rebate, they will. But if we also then start forcing them to participate in VPPs where they lose control, where we slug them with high fixed charges, what is the incentive to participate, and how will that then affect everybody else on the grid? Because we won't create a grid that is cheaper for everybody overall. And I am really invested in a solar for renters solution. That is one of the key things that we are working on at Solar Citizens at the moment, and we're actually doing a whole lot of testing on what the right policy setting is for that, because you're right, actually 30% of Australians live in rental homes and they are already disenfranchised and disempowered from clean energy. So there are other solutions for those people that will bring more cheap clean energy into the grid. You said we can't unspend money on the network, Tim, but we can better utilize the network that we have, and we can stop spending additional money on additional transmission that's unnecessary. So better sharing, better energy efficiency, better self-sufficiency in our cities, we can stop gold plating our energy system and bring down prices for everybody. That is one thing that I am excited about, is the idea of pushing more electrons through the grid that we already have, and that being the way to bring down energy prices. But this is a more sophisticated grid than we have at the moment. The massive curtailment we have at the moment that you brought up, Tim, is because of poor planning. If we had more incentives for batteries for homeowners earlier, we wouldn't be needing to have as much curtailment in the rooftop solar. We wouldn't need a sun tax, for instance. And even Ausgrid say the sun tax doesn't work. So, it's a blunt instrument here in New South Wales. We were opposed to it then. We're still opposed to it now because we don't need market signals that shut down the investment from homeowners that helps your neighbour next door.
When you ask about investment, Heidi, how important is
Tim? We might just
return?
give
I was just going to say,
just give Craig an opportunity to round that out.
No worries. Fantastic job, Heidi. Thank you for helping set some of the records straight there. I'm going to talk about a couple of matters of fact, and I'm going to talk about a couple of matters of opinion. Basically, coming back to two things. Firstly, Ashley, thank you for acknowledging that, yes, I have some sympathy for that we need some increase to fixed charges side. Although I would acknowledge that it seems that Tim is trying to slip a subscription charge Trojan horse in under the banner of a fixed charge argument. And
I'm out.
Wait your turn, Tim. And I just wonder if therefore we might have a bit of balance there, Ash, in terms of which side's sympathetic to the other. I want to come back to the impacts of the people who are vulnerable, who are disadvantaged, who use less energy. And I'd like to set an important record straight here. It's been the frustration of consumer advocates over many, many years that there is a conflation between energy use for people on hardship plans and energy use for people who are vulnerable and disadvantaged. There are two drivers that end up with people on hardship plans. They are that people lack the income to pay for their bill, and they use a lot of energy. So you do get people on hardship plans who are not in poverty generally, but who, because they use a lot of energy, are unable to manage their energy bill in particular, or because of other reasons that relate to their circumstances, they've ended up with a high energy bill. You've got people who are vulnerable and disadvantaged who aren't on hardship plans because they are low energy users. This is probably the majority of people who are vulnerable and disadvantaged. They're not on a hardship plan because they're a low energy user, and energy use is not one of the main features in their life for disadvantage. For them, it might be food, it might be other issues. So we cannot use hardship plan energy use as a proxy for disadvantage. And coming back then to that point of the spread of different consumers that we're talking about, we are looking now, and I've been working on network tariffs for a long time with this time in mind of when we have CER and DER arising. However, it's still the minority of people who have CER and DER. There are about 10 million households who use energy in the NEM. Less than half of those currently have solar, batteries, or electric vehicles, the things that we consider CER and DER. Absolutely, we need tariffs that work for and to avoid cross subsidies for the people who do have those things. We can't pivot everything to tariffs that don't work for the rest of people who don't because they choose not to, or because they're locked out, or for whatever reason. And the thing to bear in mind there is high fixed charges result in more energy use because it reduces that signal. It results in more energy use during peak times. It drives up average costs for everyone. So it's a counterproductive signal to efficiency at a time when, in the context of climate change and affordability, we need productive signals more than ever before. A final point on the subscription note, Tim, the idea is appealing. The idea that you could have a sort of fixed subscription, you pay a bit more depending on your power, and it's often likened to a phone type plan model. The problem is there's a thing you can do in phones that you can't do in energy, and that is throttle the rate at which the service is delivered. It's common in phones to have, and in data, to have less access during peak times, more during other times. In energy, the equivalent to doing that is not your peak demand, it's actually your it's your demand at peril of energy security issues. So we would need to be restricting people's use at times when they're not used to that in the same way that they're used to that in phone mechanisms. When you then take that logical step, your subscription model turns into, well, let's have something where people can use the system and pay, and voila, that ends up looking a lot more like a peak demand price, which is something that, as I mentioned before, I can get behind. But thank you.
So that's
Tim,
interesting.
before you do, thanks all. And I know that you would really like to come back on a couple of those points. What I am going to ask you to do is to weave that in while responding to the audience's questions as well, because they've been posting those on Slido. I'm going to hand over to Jordan, who's going to help us bring through some of these questions now.
Thanks, James. So let's start with the top voted question. How can democratisation assist the renters and high-rise apartment owners who can't afford a car, let alone solar cells? So you've all addressed that already a little bit, but maybe you'd like to have another go at that.
I mean, I'm happy to take that one because that's a major focus of the work that we're doing. So I came on board Solar Citizens the same day that the Albanese government kicked in 2022. And I think you remember that there was the Ukraine war and an energy crisis. So we looked around at what are the solutions that we need basically to create solar for all so that everybody can benefit from cheap, clean energy and to help with cost of living. Apartments and renters are the hardest thing to solve, which is why it's now our major focus now that we helped with the cheaper home battery rebate win. And a big part of that we're looking at for renters and apartments is these urban renewable energy zones, but we need best practice in those so that you can upscale solar and storage on industrial and commercial warehouses, and share that with neighbouring apartments. So when I first heard about the Ausgrid Community Power Network, I thought this is actually what we've already been talking about. But there are complications with that particular proposal, which means that it's not as popular as it could be. But I don't think that means we should shut down the idea of urban renewable energy zones. We need to come up with the policies for what is best practice. And I know that from, like, I live here in Botany, in Botany Bay area where that's happening, but we had been already working on an Electrify Walleye Creek high-rise electrification project. How do you retrofit high-rises that are only 10 years old but are built with gas, with no EV, with no rooftop solar, with no batteries? It's extremely difficult to electrify a pre-existing apartment. So part of that solution that we came up with was we knew that there were big industrial warehouses nearby. Could we not get the power from them to feed over to sort of strata batteries for Walleye Creek? It's a really big issue. I think urban renewable energy zones are part of the answer. Part of the answer is building new buildings that have clean energy mandates. So things like the transport-oriented developments in New South Wales, around 40 train stations, where they want to build 180,000 homes by 2035, I think it is. Make sure that they are built without gas, that they're EV ready, that they're battery ready, that they've got solar for at least common areas. That's something we've been pushing Planning Minister Scully on. Unfortunately, he's not particularly receptive. He's more interested in what's good for the developers, is what his answers have been.
Bastard.
But the other part of that is solar for renters. So this is a really important mechanism that we need to find, and we need to get consensus with groups like the Justice and Equity Centre as well around what those mechanisms are. And Craig, I think you could also talk to that, because I know you've done a deep dive into that as well.
Thanks, Heidi. I think you've covered it well, and maybe we'll let Tim or Ashley respond, but I'm happy to cover.
Look, I think they're really important points. The only problem, one problem I'd like to really get across is CBA funded, Commonwealth Bank funded a significant bit of work on property research on the impact of energy efficiency, rooftop solar, batteries, etc., on the value of homes. And what we're now seeing is that the increase, installing rooftop solar, batteries, making your house efficient, home energy management systems, are delivering a significant increase in the value of the property. One would hope that that's going to entice, particularly in the rental market, to get investment onto putting those services in there. There's an underlying challenge that if we keep talking about payback is related to use, the landlords are, they're resisting. They go, so there's nothing in this for me, or trying to work out how to add it on top. So there's a problem. There's a fundamental problem there. And we need to try and work out how to do that. When it comes to this new development stuff, and I worry very much about Minister Scully as well, because what's happening a lot in developers at the moment is they're doing these side deals for embedded networks for everything from hot water, cold water, the energy systems and services around there, about EV charging and facilities. So they become costs that end up incurring in your strata fees. And that's, apples for apples with someone else in another house. It's a real problem. I think Craig is also the point we're talking about here is we need to understand about the flexibility of subscriptions with a dynamic operating envelope and how those signals work together, particularly when a congestion charge comes into play about saying, I've actually got to manage actual congestion. And because I feel like we're on the same page when it comes to what he talks about with the shared peak demand charge versus a subscription charge, because that's what a dynamic operating envelope is. When it gets triggered and there is a charge, it is a peak demand charge, and quite a sharp one, probably much sharper than Craig would expect. So that's a question. Ashley?
No, only thing I'd add, maybe I'm a bit of a contrarian to an extent. I don't think the solution, so I'm talking about maybe the access for solar for people that have barriers to getting it. I think the solution is just not necessarily to how do we get solar on a roof, but just set the price structures and cost recovery mechanisms so we don't have to worry about making a problem in the first place that everybody looks at. Yeah.
I think your idea, Ashley, when we were talking before, you might bring that bit about water in, about the difference between water and what happens in a rental environment with your water rates.
I think the overlay I would add to all of this is around fit for purpose business models and expectations of the right parties to do things. Because we have a structure where we rely on distributors to distribute energy and retailers to sell it, whenever our market bodies make a reform or decide to introduce a new service or shift a service, they give it to one of those, and often decreasingly they're the right party for that. So some would argue that distributors aren't the right party to be running curbside EV charging. Retailers aren't the right parties to be dealing with people's VPPs. Yet we don't have the innovation that's needed to bring the third parties in, and going to Heidi's point, the community ownership models that could help to leverage some of those things, the barriers to entry for those when they get forced into those other, they're like square pegs that get forced into the round other business model holes, where they're not a good fit. And this then goes to Ash's point. If we end up with price signals that are there to allow for sharing energy at times in a way that doesn't create new disadvantage, that helps to optimize a bit of that curtailment to the extent that it's effective to do so, and without then introducing a whole lot of other costs to manage the wavering voltage and short circuit current issues in the system, then we can hit a better balance. But I think we have a really fundamental challenge to overcome at a policy level there, to get our policymakers and our rule makers and regulators unthinking their current way of business modelling the energy system.
Can I also just say to Ashley's point that maybe we don't need solar on renters' homes? I mean, I think this whole debate is around getting to net zero. And with 30% of homes in Australia renters, we need those rooftops to be solar because we need to decarbonise.
Yeah, and I think I don't forget the fact that with virtualisation, the idea of a virtual NIMI, that's what digitalisation is, and a network and subscriptions around networks are about, is, I can effectively be taking energy from someone else's roof, be it the service, but there's a deduction on their NIMI and an addition on my NIMI. So we can get to do a lot of digitalisation and transactions behind the scene that make this really easy. We can have community solar, and it's adding to, my share of it. If I own 10 square metres of a solar farm, could be even 100 miles away, but it adds into how the service works and adds into the bill. So I think we've got to understand a little bit about the benefit of digitisation and transactive stuff. And if that's the case, we certainly don't want to be saying there's this much of friction associated with it. It's like GST added on top of buying my milkshake. I'd rather it didn't have a 10-cent charge on it. So if I could have the whole thing without GST, it'd be better. So we don't want that extra friction if we can avoid it. And it's a matter about how you make that work in a bigger environment. Jordan, you might have
So perhaps that's, and that probably dovetails quite well. So Ian's posed the question of evolution or revolution of the economic layers of this issue. So he points out that the world we're moving into, it looks like we're going to have abundant cheap storage, perhaps something like zero marginal cost generation. So is the engineering problem that we faced with the old system still the one that we face today, which is how the market layer of the current grid was formed to deal with those to control those engineering problems? We now have different engineering problems. What are the economic layers that we should have? So more than just the pricing, looking a little bit deeper into the economic structure.
I wouldn't mind having a stab at this if people are happy to. So as a reformed electrical engineer myself, I feel like the engineering problems that we have are largely not to do with the engineering. They're to do with the mindset, and they're to do with the slowness to consider emerging issues and address those before they become too big to address without creating winners and losers. And so at a larger grid scale level, we've known for a long time that issues around inertia being a real issue, the lack of inertia in a system as we have a more, picking up on Ian's point, zero marginal cost electronic generation from solar and wind, more batteries and storage. We know we need to address that inertia issue. We've seen it coming for a long time, yet our market operators and rule makers have not addressed that engineering challenge in a timely way. And we've now got the most expensive way possible of dealing with that by bundling it into system strength and giving it to transmission businesses to manage. At the same time, the issue of curtailment is something that I've been banging on about for a long time, saying, hey, we're going to have abundant renewables. This is a great thing. It's going to mean we can have more than we can use. That difference means, and when I say more than we can use, more than you can just crank up the thermostat on your air conditioner to suck up a degree or two's worth here. We're talking many orders of magnitude more abundant renewables. It goes up exponentially, the amount of surplus, as you approach a 100% renewable system. We need to work out that not just from an engineering perspective, but from a fairness perspective. How do you share the pain of curtailment? We have a situation at the moment where households are paid to export from their roofs from solar at the same time as all the generators in the utility scale market have switched off because they would be paying to export. And that's occurring at a time when it's resulting in minimum system load issues, where AEMO is then having to pay batteries to charge and discharge out of cycle to manage that issue, a cost that then gets passed through to all consumers. For a fraction of that cost, we could probably be subsidizing putting more batteries in people's homes and doing things to be alternatives to trying to export that energy and squeeze it into the system. Instead, it's money spent that's going to operational stuff rather than capital to provide long-term solutions. Some of those are real structural issues that are going to hang around until we have major reforms, but some of them are also real engineering problems in the sense that engineering shouldn't just be looking at the technology issues that you've got in front of you at this point in time. It needs to be forward-looking about emerging issues and have regard to the social impacts of the engineering decisions that we make.
Absolutely. So Ty Christopher, who spoke last week, and Scott Ryan, both were at Endeavour Energy, and there's some argument of which one of them coined the term distribution revolution in events of there's no transition without transmission. So we definitely need it. And the question is how do we make that happen? And it's not an easy one. The thing you've highlighted there is the market power we've got with the gentailers at the moment are able to push economic curtailment of the renewables generation because they're not buying PPAs. You know, basically every solar farm that's being built now, you know, it has to go to market and they're losing capture rates as a result. David Leach from ITK has written a great paper explaining the challenges around that. So we've got to get these things sorted out where we actually don't see negative pricing, or we should see closer to that marginal cost or at least capital cost recovery. And that's how we get that pricing and make it available. Now, current retailers aren't doing it. And I just reinforce that the friction of network charges only makes the matter worse. The long weekend, the October long weekend, there was 200 gigawatt hours of wasted curtailment. That wasn't network congestion curtailment. That was purely grid energy that was lost. They announced that Collie went online. You know, Collie made a big announcement. It's the biggest battery, longest hours, 580 megawatts, a couple of thousand gigawatt hours of storage. That's 22,400 EVs. Compare them with a 25 kilowatt hour Sargent Store DC bidirectional charger. You got the same battery. So we've got these things that are out there. We just need to be able to enable consumers. And it's not trying to lumber charges on all these consumers. What we're trying to do is work out, you know, if I've got a big battery, I should be able to charge it from the grid or from my rooftop solar, and the value of the energy should be more or less the same. And if we start looking at the value of solar on our roofs as being covered in the value of our property, like whether I've got a flash bathroom or I've got nice kitchen stuff, it becomes less of an issue to worry about payback. And it's something we do, and it's part of a community thing.
Okay, so Ibrahim's asked a question that others have supported. He says dynamic pricing is the way to reduce energy bills. Also, the energy should be managed by pricing, not by constraints. And then he offers up the Ausgrid and Reposit Power Project Edith as an example of how this might be worked and scaled.
Hey, Ibrahim. Good to see you again. I'll just note the point that the Project Edith tariff has a pretty high fixed charge. That's just the consequence of it. And that's the future, right? You have a pretty set stable base to recover the repex and the boring stuff that has to be incurred. And you can send really short, sharp dynamic signals to those if you're part of a VPP or with Reposit or whoever it is. I think we all agree that's the opportunity here. Yeah, it's not send price signals to my grandma. It's send price signals to the things that can respond. And yes, we really drive down costs. Just remembering that system cost does not equal price. Price can be a function of demand, and yeah, you can get these weird trick things that happen. You can pat yourself on the back by saying system costs have gone down, but then you look at the prices and the prices have gone another way. So we just need to think this through carefully.
The only thing with Edith, and where I have a problem with the Reposit part of the model is they insist no subscription. So they want to get to the point as a business participant, they're actually trying to say no bill and give them the opportunity to make money. There's no guarantee in the Reposit part of that model. So they're basically saying as soon as congestion hits, that sharp charge is applied to every kilowatt that you're using, or every kilowatt hour, because it's a volumetric impost. They're charging you for that. Where if I've paid a fixed fee, my view is I should have a subscription that gives me a guarantee that I'm not going to have to pay that fee if I conform to what I've agreed to. Now, the Reposits and the other retailers involved in Project Edith argue that they're the partners with Edith and the network, and the consumers should be ignored, and they're going to try and deliver some system benefit. I got a lot of time for a lot of effort for what Dean Spaccavento and his team have done, but at the same time, they're not delivering benefits to the consumer, they're delivering benefits for their business. And they want a business model that delivers that. And at the end of the day, any business trying to make money is taking it from some consumer somewhere.
I wouldn't mind picking up on the price signal piece. You know, it's funny, we don't just pay $2 an hour for bread and get all the bread we want. You go to a shop and you buy the number of bread loaves you want, and you pay on a user pays basis for them. We don't call the price of bread a price signal. We just call it the price of the product, and you buy it and you eat it, you use it, and you pay for it. It's funny to think that in energy, we would move away from this idea that you don't just pay for it because you use it, and that you instead have some other way of having a philosophical arrangement with that, where you pay for it because it's of its theoretical potential to be supplied, and you could theoretically use an average amount. That's kind of what's behind the idea of having a really, really high fixed charge. And I'm using that, there's a lot in that really, because I think we are in agreement there needs to be some fixed charge element. And I wanted to actually highlight something that, from having a lot of these discussions outside of this debate and in, a lot of us aren't that far apart on our ultimate ideas of the problems and solutions, but the areas where we do have different views have quite a lot hanging off them. And what I see is often the case, it's the what are you actually paying for is what it comes down to. It's the what's the changeable bit, what's the variable bit, what's the future looking bit, what's the fair distribution of what you're paying for now. A lot of the models that we look at for potentially sharing it, be it subscription or peak demand, aren't that far apart. Even what we call a peak demand tariff is actually derived from a volumetric amount of use in a short period of time as a proxy for a peak kilowatt demand amount. And it always has been, because that's how we use and measure energy. But I wouldn't minimize it to suggest that there isn't a lot of controversy about it, but when you drill down, the number of issues that are actually on the table that there are different views on are quite small in number. So I still have hope that we can land a common sense solution in energy reform, where the affirmative side here sees the error of their ways, and just and joins our call for having
So,
more
so
dynamic
the
pricing.
only thing I'd say there with Craig is it's not sort of saying we're going to charge this new fixed fee. At the moment, every customer is paying a certain amount of their bill in network cost recovery. And what we don't see in our bills is an understanding of what that was. In a one-way system, it was really clear that we all paid that via our consumption, and now we have it split. And it's not just delivery of the electrons or energy that the network does. It stabilizes our voltage. It delivers frequency to our services. It makes sure our equipment is safe. There's all these things that go into it that are not tangible associated with the movement of electricity or the delivery of their electric products. The bread's actually the electricity, not the roads that I use to get there and the other services that I need to make it available. The ability to go to the shops, the parking provided by Heidi's local council. You know, they're the things that fall into this part of the system. And we've just got to try and work out how to do it in such a way that's fair, reasonable, and equitable, and delivers the maximum productivity. And that's the challenge. I'm the first to admit it, that it's, you know, the subscription type model is easy on a lot of levels from a digital perspective. But I take some of my out of domain experience in the wagering space, for example. You know, it was a regulated industry. The TAB had the whole thing lock, stock, and barrel, and all of a sudden consumers got control because they have one of these and they could, oh, my phone disappeared. There you go. I can get I can go to any bookmaker anywhere and there's no friction, and that dramatically.
Tim.
Yep.
Well, I know this group can go on debating this for a long time. So
it's 2:00.
We are going to have to wrap up. I would encourage everyone to revisit, please, the Slido and to cast their votes. We've had 4 amazing speakers talk today and share their views and explore some of these issues. You can see that it's quite a challenging and complex issue to work through. Could you please join that Slido? And then, Jordan, will you be wrapping up then?
Well, just while we're giving a few minutes for people to vote on their Slido.
I actually don't have a vote option, so the vote's not active.
Oh, sorry. Let me make sure that's working. There, that should now be.
Yep, it is.
Okay. What I did want to do is just point out that if you go into the Slido Q&A, Heather Smith has made a generous offer and shared a link to her calculator, which she says is a tariff calculator for nerds in the community to play with fixed, variable, and demand pricing and think about insurance and other equity options. So thank you, Heather, for sharing that.
Thanks, Heather.
And I'll leave it for you to look at the other comments that were in Slido at the time. So now we're just waiting for people to make their votes on the poll that's active now. And it's moving along.
It's not displaying on the screen, or you just got.
No. It'll display in a minute.
Look, we've got a lot to lose here, Jordan.
Yes.
Keeping the tension there, Tim.
Yeah, we didn't resolve how to deal with the handicap at the start. So.
Oh well, but we've got, as I said, we've got more to lose. It's about the same number of voters now. I think it was 23 at the beginning, so it's just a bit.
Yeah. So there were 24 votes in the first poll. We're now up to 22 votes total in the second poll.
Come on, everyone, get your votes in. For or against? Vote for.
Because there's
any traction.
There's still over 30 people in the room, so
come on, you got your voting, Craig. You've got to vote for yourself. Heidi.
I've already voted 14 times, Tim.
I thought Heidi was going to say vote early, vote often.
I wish I was smart enough to work out how to do that.
All right. Well, the voting is still open, but it's currently running at a much closer.
Well done, opposition.
Yeah, well done, Heidi. I think that all comes down to your contribution.
Thank you, Craig. I will just say power to the people, for the people, by the people. That's my pitch for your future votes.
Look, I'd like to say that I think Craig was right. We're actually much closer on a lot of these things. It's about understanding how to do it, that it's not for all consumers. You know, there's definitely circumstances where we shouldn't have fixed charges. There's other ones where we should. And it's trying to find that mix of tariffs and services that are going to be beneficial. And that's our objective.
Very good. Well, look, I'd like to thank you all. I'd like everybody online to, in whatever way you feel appropriate, thank James and the entire panel, Heidi and Ashley and Craig and Tim, for all of their time and effort and dealing with a very, very challenging topic. And indeed, throughout the Australia 4.0 debates, we've structured them as debates to try and help force the discussion forward, because it is complex. Each of the issues being consulted and considered is complex. And the truth is, most of the people committed to the process of transformation of our electricity system have broad agreement that there are these big complexities. And as Craig was pointing out, it's down in the details that hang off each of the subtle decisions that challenge us to find the right path forward. So I'd encourage you all to join us again next Friday, when we'll have the third debate in the series about standards and how they underpin our national success. And until that time, thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you to our panelists, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next Friday.